Okay, this will be our opening. We'll jump into the lesson here at this point. Mike, is so funny you said that. So please don't judge me here with what I'm about to say. Okay,
That's
Amy,
not.
don't judge me here. Okay. So on Sunday mornings, when I go to get this, I often listen to Bishop Fulton Sheen on Catholic radio. Bishop Sheen has actually died. He's been gone for a number of years, but he was a phenomenal like teacher and preacher. I mean, he's Catholic. I mean, so you got to weigh that into everything. But he does a phenomenal job. He opened his lesson today, similar to what you said there, Mike. He said he's like, I was at this university getting ready to give a lecture about Jonah, and some heckler from the back said, that was false, and how do you know that Jonah was real? And Bishop Sheen responded, well, I'll ask him when I'll get there. And then the heckler replied back, well, what if he's not there? And then Bishop Sheen said, well, then you can ask him when you get there.
Yep.
Thank you. Jeremy, that was kind of funny.
That was good.
There was Scott, I've sent you a couple of Facebook guys,
Okay.
You get the one that where the guy goes through all the different things in creation. He's more scientific than I could ever be.
If you sent it to me in the past 2 weeks, probably.
No,
okay.
It's probably more longer ago than that.
Okay. Yeah, I know. Pretty much everything you send me is good stuff, Mike. I'm not recalling it off the top of my head, but
I wish I could remember his name. I can't remember his name right off the top of my head.
Okay.
But
share, you can type it in the chat if it comes to mind as we're doing this. So.
Oh, my mind brain don't work that way.
Well, email me or message me.
Yeah.
One of those methods.
He goes through a lot of the scientific type stuff. He was talking about carbon dating and how they're starting to realize that there's fallacies within carbon dating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess the guy that's most influenced me with regards to the carbon, I mean, because that's not a new argument that people have used, that because of the half-life and decay rates, we can't assume that they're constant, going back a long time ago. First of all, that's more technical than I could ever, weigh in on whether that's right or whether it's not. I guess my default is, if God is the God of all truth and he is a God of order and structure who has designed constants that are observable and knowable, I'm open to the idea that decay rates have changed maybe. But I haven't heard anything that's definitively persuasive at this point, but I'm also biased because, I'm persuaded at this point that of the old Earth perspective. So, but that's not to say that I believe that Darwinian evolution is correct. Like, I don't think that's correct either. But anyway, okay. Let's jump in. I'll read through the review here and we'll go through this probably a little bit quicker, and hopefully the discussion is, as full as we can make it in our small numbers here. So, all right, book 4. In chapter 1, Lewis argues that there is a real right and wrong to which all humanity is subject, referred to as the law of human nature, law of decent behavior, moral law, or just fair play. This law is universal, but unlike scientific laws like gravity, the law of human nature can be broken. Secondly, Lewis points out that in spite of our constant appeals to this law of fair play, none of us keep it. And I think, I can't remember if I mentioned this to you guys. I don't know when I had this conversation, but I called up a gal who I went to high school with. She's a year older than me. Did I tell you guys this story? She's very outspoken. I got no impression that she had any serious religious background, although in the conversation I had with her, I found out she did have a at least minimal cultural one. But I wanted to ask her, she is very outspoken on the ideas of right and wrong and justice, especially in this political environment. And I wanted to ask her, because we've been studying it in Lewis, I called her up and I said, hey, where do you get your idea of right and wrong? And I expected her to really push back on a universal right and wrong that all people at all times could be accountable to. And to my surprise, she actually embraced the idea right away. She even thought referring to it as in accordance with the golden rule, love your neighbor as yourself, was actually a great way to describe it. And so it was a fascinating conversation because I didn't expect her to jump on board with what Lewis is saying here. But the reality is getting people to jump in on this level might be easier than we think in our environment. It's where you start to go beyond this, is where things get a little bit crazy. And Lewis doesn't quite get to that point here in book 1, but we're gonna get awfully close, and we'll see that today. In chapter 2, Lewis addresses some objections to his argument from chapter 1. It is true that the law of decent behavior, at first glance, does look like it would be the result of a herd instinct or simply a social convention. However, upon examination, each encounter we have with it points towards it being universal, to which all men are subject. Chapter 2 is really just kind of an extension of chapter 1 in many respects, and he addressed these issues and again points to the reality that oftentimes we may encounter people who articulate an objection to this law of fair play, but when you start seeing how they play it out in their day-to-day lives and the interactions they have with people, it actually is pretty consistent with fair play as Lewis describes it. So, and then chapter 3, Lewis adds to his argument that the moral law is a reality and not a human invention made for practical reasons. Quoting from chapter 3, Lewis states, "It's not simply a statement about how we should like men to behave for our own convenience. For the behavior we call bad and unfair is not exactly the same as the behavior we find inconvenient. It may even be the opposite." And I thought that was a pretty profound point for people who take the argument that the law of morality and right and wrong is just a social convention purely contrived by humanity for practical reasons. But as Lewis pointed out there, and I thought the real simple example of him getting a seat on a bus, I think makes a pretty strong case that that the moral law is not something that is practical. Sometimes it is, but oftentimes it's not. So to suggest that morality was developed for purely practical reasons, I don't think holds weight. And that's where we left off. Any thoughts on chapters 1 through 3 before we jump into chapter 4 here? All right, here we go. Leading us into chapter 4. Ever since men were able to think, they have been wondering what this universe really is and how it came to be there. And very roughly, two views have been held. Before we get into those two views, you can comment in the chat portion of this, or since we're a small group, if you just wanted to say, I was curious who or what over the course of your life has influenced your understanding of how the universe came to be. Mike, we'll start with you, and I'll just go around in a circle. Amy, we'll come to you last, if that's okay.
Well, of course, the first influence was going to Sunday school and was told that God created the heavens and the earth. So being a young kid in Sunday school, I believed it right away. And why would an adult lie to me? That type of thing. But and then I never really strayed from it because I never really bought into the idea, the evolutionary idea. The one that I liked the best was where you kid brought a model of the universe into or at least our solar system, into the science fair. And the teacher says, "Wow, that's really a nice model. You got everything just right. It all moves just right. The moon goes around. How did you do that?" And he said, "I just threw everything in the box and rattled it a few times, and boom, it was there." And the teacher kind of laughed. "Yeah, you're funny." He said, "Well, yeah, that's what I thought when you tried to teach me what you were teaching."
Well played. Well played.
I've never really strayed from the idea that God created the universe and everything, and all the things that I read over time. When you get into, I'm not a scientist by any means, so I may get this partially wrong, but when you get down below the cell level, and you get into these strands that are actually number sequences, and if the number sequence is off, it don't work.
Mm-hmm.
There just has to be something there that says this was created.
Yeah, there was a video put out by the Hoover Institution. They do a number of videos, but I think it was a year and a half ago, they put out a video with a guy named David Berlinski and gosh, who is the Princeton professor or Yale professor of computer science who was there? David somebody, whatever. And forgetting all the name, whatever. The point is, in this interview, that the whole focus of the discussion was the mathematical improbability of Darwinian evolution. It just, there isn't, even in the most generous of time frames and billions of years, it's not enough time for all the chances to turn out correctly. And then when you factor in exactly what you said, Mike, the computer science prof said, yeah, it's like going to a computer, imagining that you could randomly type zeros and ones to generate a brand new program, and you find that it crashes the whole thing. And so computer science in many respects has really buttressed the notion that pure random chance getting us to where we are today is just statistically not probable at best.
One of the other examples, and I can't remember what part, how this is inside a cell, and I can't remember how it works, but it's actually kind of a donut shaped piece that has almost like a ball joint and screw mechanism that comes out of it. And it's actually a machine that does work inside the cell. So to have that just don't happen. It just don't happen.
Yeah. It's
looks at things that tight and then say that it could evolve from nothing. Has more faith than I have.
Yeah. I agreed. Wernleys, we'll go to you next. What influences have you had in your life with regards to your understanding of the universe?
Yeah, I would say family and friends, definitely just relationships. Just whether that has been a huge influence for me, just through conversation, and that like igniting whether I look for a search in the Bible or to that I went through a period in college where I was really searching if I really believed in God because of where I lived or who I lived with, or if it was actually like my own faith. And so I was influenced definitely by just the people I was around. But then ultimately my own like experiences and just my own encounter with the Lord, that's been the greatest influence and saving for me. I would definitely say people and personal experiences had the greatest influence on me. So
cool.
Yeah. Well, it's obviously challenging to summarize all things that you're aware of influences. Some big ones are just like Mr. Mosman over here, Mossman, right? Mr. Mossman.
As written.
Mossman. I can relate to that. People mispronounce Wernley all the time, but it's as written as well.
Yeah. Same with Carl.
Yeah. But so like Bible school, Bible studies, church was first influence, my people, closest people around me, and then school. And then I think it was when I was about 21 where I just like this dialogue between God and I started to begin, and it was just not to begin but continued, and it was just simply put, realizing that something can't come from nothing, and just that simple concept really started to change everything for me. And I started to search what always is. And so to me, I just knew logically and ever since then that always is the only answer.
Mm-hmm.
And so there has to be something that's always, and not only always, but conscious. And so to be a mind is what this chapter is that we're in. So that really influenced, just the creation of all things. And then as far as like, knowing that God's the creator and the God of the Bible is the creator, but like old earth, new earth, there's like lots of different things, different scientists and apologetic people and philosophers and stuff like that have influenced me.
Mm-hmm.
I would add to mine too, like a huge one would be taking like anatomy and physiology, like that class in college really influenced me because like we had cadavers that we worked on. And so like to see like the human body and just to learn about how it takes so much to just move my hand or, take a breath, like just how intricately we're designed. And it's like, I'm in my body all day long and I still don't understand all the things that go on with it, and I don't know, it just really blows my mind. So I'd be like, there has to be like a designer, for all these things, so.
Yeah. Totally agree.
Jeremy, you can call me Mike. You don't have to call me Mr.
That's a compliment. He still has the.
With my dad. So.
All right. I'd be honored to, Mike.
Jeremy, that's a compliment. He hasn't even given me that offer yet.
No, I haven't.
Amy, tell us about your experience and where, your understanding of the universe, how it came about.
I never understood it. I don't have family that's in a church. So I mean,
should I assume then, school was primarily where you started to entertain the idea of it?
not really.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay.
I mean, since I just started going to church, I've been still getting confused about other things.
And that will be a process that will go on your whole life. So don't feel like you're the only one who encounters tough questions that you have to wrestle with. I'm sure all of us here would say the same thing. And for me, one of them, not related to the universe, but communion. Communion's one I struggle with. I genuinely view it. What's the word? Not sacrament. What's the opposite of a sacrament? An ordinance. I think it's Anyway, but there's times where I think, maybe there could be some credence to the teaching that it's the literal body and blood of Christ, but I don't know. So you're just, all that is to say, you're not alone with big questions. And what I hope comes about is, as a result of this, is to some degree, you have a better understanding, first and foremost biblically, but also even how it plays out in the real world. Because if all truth is God's truth, then we will see it play out even in secular domains. So like you guys, I grew up in the church. When I wrote this question, I was thinking that there may be some people in our class who didn't grow up in the church, and I was thinking like that'd be really interesting to hear how they formulated their understanding. There was a similar question to this asked at the Czech camp that I went to a couple of years ago, and it was just really fascinating because the reality is when you're around church people your whole life, like that's a blessing for sure, but it can be hard to wrap your mind around the way other people experience some of these more basic ideas like the universe. So with that being said, let's get into the two views as Lewis describes them. The first blank right here is the word two, TWO, which if you've read the chapter is actually misleading, but we're going to go with two right now. Next blank, the materialist view. The materialist view. And if you want to know how to spell materialist, look down and right from the blank. Quoting from Lewis, first, there is what is called the materialist view. People who take that view think that matter and space just happen to exist and have always existed. Nobody knows why, and that matter, behaving in certain fixed ways, has just happened by a sort of fluke to produce creatures like ourselves who are able to think. By one chance in 1,000, something hit our sun and made it produce the planets. And by another 1,000th chance, the chemicals necessary for life and the right temperature occurred on one of these planets. And so some of the matter on this earth became alive. And then by a very long series of chances, the living creatures developed into things like us. It's kind of a rough way to put it, but that's basically it. It's all chance and atoms, Let's go to the top of the second page. The second view that Lewis is going to discuss, he refers to as the religious view. The religious view. And the word religious is down and slightly right from the blank. So use that as your guide. The other view is the religious view. According to it, what is behind the universe is more like a mind than it is like anything else we know. That is to say, it is conscious and has purposes and prefers one thing to another. And on this view, it made the universe partially for purposes we do not know, but partially. And at any rate, in order to produce creatures like itself. I mean, like itself to the extent of having minds. So basically, to sum those two views up, we have just random chance and atoms that have always been here. And the religious view is that there's something behind what we see in the material world that designed it with purpose. Which leads us to question one. And we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but people can weigh in if they have additional thoughts. Do you agree with Lewis that these are the two general views of the universe? Are there any other views that Lewis should have mentioned here? Note, you're not allowed to describe the view discussed at the end of the chapter. Are there any other?
Your question, I'm pretty sure I heard it, but just in case I missed it.
Yeah, I'll reread it here. Do you agree with Lewis that these are the two general views of the universe? Are there any other views that Lewis should have mentioned here? And note, you are not allowed to describe the view he discusses at the end of the chapter.
Well, since I asked you to repeat the question, I'll go ahead and take the honor of answering that first. The first thing I thought was no. The three things that come to my mind in my wording is that there's only God, there's only universe, or there's both. So to me, there's three schools of thought.
Hold on, so only God, only universe, or both?
Yeah.
Okay, so what would the only God reality look like?
Probably like what he was speaking of, life force. Potentially could fall under that. I'm not sure. But there's a lot of, it's not something that I could necessarily speak on comprehensively. Just none of it makes sense to me. But,
so kind of like this whole world is a dream, maybe.
You could say that to some extent, like kind of like the idea, and I think that there's some precedence like that for someone to like think that way. Depending on wording, it's like right is that like there is only just God, so everything is like pieces of one face. You know what I mean? And I think that isn't necessarily not what the Bible's saying to some extent. But I think there's been schools of thought taking it to an extent that really doesn't actually agree with what I believe the Christian view is both God and universe. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Any other thoughts?
You're leaving out the ancient alien theories?
I am, and I should have noted that because every Friday night on the History Channel,
Yes, I know.
they tell those stories.
The History Channel.
The History Channel wouldn't put anything on that's not factually true, so I trust the History Channel.
Yeah.
Amy or Drea, any thoughts?
I guess my first thought was that say no, but so I was trying to think of like what other views that
Yeah.
there would be, and I guess my reason why I thought no too was because there's so many people believe that there's so many different genders out
Mhm.
there, and that's like a very simple topic, and so to think that to see two views of the whole universe, I'm sure that there are other views that I'm not thinking of. I just so but I don't really have to share that would be.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and I would say too, I mean, just in general, like when I read Lewis, especially Mere Christianity, like he does a pretty good job of getting the broad strokes. It's like anything, you're always going to find somebody who has some obscure, nuanced view, but by virtue of the fact that some other alternative view might be out there, if it is completely obscure and outside of the main ideas, you can't as I say, you can't deal with the things that that just aren't well known.
Well, the three I've always heard of is the one is, of course, the creation view. The second one is the evolution view. But the third one is it's always been this way. It's never been any different.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And in that view, it's kind of a cyclic thing. You have life, and you have the end of life, but you also have periods of over the hundreds of thousands of years. Maybe man was this is our turn, and maybe in the next 100,000 years it's something else. It's that kind of where it's always a recreation. Maybe they we destroy the earth, for like the environmentalists like to say, we've destroyed the earth, we can't live here anymore. It takes another 100,000 years for the earth to
regenerate or whatever,
and then life starts again. So that is one of the other theories that I have always heard. So that's one of the three that I've always heard.
Well, I was thinking when I read this about Einstein's data basically, well, again, I'm not a scientist, so I'm trying to go from memory, but it basically demonstrated that the universe is finite. And I can't remember the exact technology. It has to do with, the light and the different wavelengths and traveling and that sort of stuff. But the long and short of it is all the brilliant people up through Einstein expected it to be infinite, to be a steady state, potentially like that view you described, Mike. But the data points to a finite universe, which is why now one of the popular views out there is the multiverse theory, which is just our universe is one of an infinite number of universes, and just basically takes the materialist view and just spreads it out even further. So a thought like that is fine if there's data to support it, but I don't even know how you can barely make a reasonable theory about one universe, let alone multi.
They set the SETI project to do that, to set up these telescopes that would receive information from, and they said that at the beginning of this, that they will get billions of data back from all these places where we'll find life. Well, over the years, it's gone from billions to hundreds of thousands to now they're just hoping that they might get 100 pieces of data that says there's life out there. I think that has pretty much proven that this is kind of a singular event.
Hey, I'll answer. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Go.
An answer to the question that you asked me more, so I could share more comprehensively in this moment. Pantheism is one that people consider to be that kind of view of only God view. So this person wrote, pantheism is the view that the world is either identical to God or an expression of God's nature. So that's why I said, like, sometimes it's kind of like it's so close to the idea of what the reality is. But it takes it to a place of really kind of taking away the actual identity of God to some extent, you know what I mean? And so it almost like turns the universe into God and God into the universe, but separates what Lewis calls the mind what we
Or
would
may-
call the mind.
Or
Yeah.
may the force be with you.
Yes. Yeah. That's why. So I think actually, which you said not to jump ahead, but I think that does fall under the third worldview that I'm talking about.
It does, but I mean, Lewis uses terminology that's slightly different, so I won't consider that an answer, a stolen answer, Jeremy.
Great.
it's
It's still stolen. I didn't make it up, but
well, pantheism. I mean, that's more of the worldview of the East. The Buddhism, the Hinduism, and all that sort of stuff. So I mean,
Exactly.
the
Yeah.
fact of the matter in the West, like we're not as well versed in that.
Right.
Ravi Zacharias did a really good job of giving me a minimal knowledge of it in a lot of his talks. But
Me too.
so YouTubing him would be a good source to
Mm.
do some follow up on that if anyone's interested. So
And I think that's one of the reasons why there's a certain, I wouldn't say exactly separate him because he's not to say the only Indian apologist, but I do think that with the type of platform that he reached, he was very unique in that way, that he had that cultural background that a lot of apologists didn't have.
Yeah.
So he really understood how to speak to that audience as well. It was very interesting.
yeah, no, totally agreed. Which actually I have some thoughts on that idea and how it plays out in the realm of missions, but that's another topic for another day. Anyway, let's move on. Good discussion, Amy. Unless you're chomping at the bit to weigh in. Okay, be ready though. I might be coming back to you later on. Okay, next blank. Science. Science as judge between the two views. That's a very popular note. Oh, actually, you know what? I'm going to try something new here, especially since we have a small group. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully I don't crash the Zoomcast. But I wanted to share a photo of a poster that was hanging up at Moline High School because it fits into this section well. So let me see if I can do. Oh, I can't share. The host disabled unless.
I was trying to, there is a way I think to give it to you. This one's not showing now to do it though.
Can we just make it a host?
Yeah, I can make you the host though, but that's probably about. Usually it used to give me an option, that's really weird.
That's fine. It was here. One more time here. Yeah, no, that's fine. Anyway, I'm looking at the poster here. It's the artwork. I mean, is kind of 1960s looking ish, but it was more of a retro poster. But it says at the top the phrase "Defenders of Truth," and then down below, "Science is our future." Defenders of Truth, science is our future, and
They haven't read this chapter.
they haven't. No, and I thought maybe we could discuss that, at least that phrase in that poster after we read this here. So let me read what Lewis wrote. Please do not think that one of these views was held a long time ago and the other has gradually taken its place. Like that was interesting. I didn't remember that line, but the materialist view and the religious view have actually both been the predominant views for human history. Moving on. Wherever there have been thinking men, both views turn up. And note this too. You cannot find out which view is the right one by science in the ordinary sense. Science works by experiments. It watches how things behave. Every scientific statement in the long run, however complicated it looks, really means something like, I pointed the telescope to such and such a part of the sky at 2:20 a.m. on January 15th and saw so-and-so. Or, I put some of this stuff in a pot and heated it to such and such a temperature and it did so-and-so. Do not think that I am saying anything against science. I am only saying what its job is. And the more scientific a man is, the more I believe he would agree with me that this is the job of science, and a very useful and necessary job too. But, and here's the next blank, why anything comes to be there at all, and whether there is anything behind the things science observes, something of a different kind, This is not a scientific question. And then going on to that next quote, if there is something behind, then either it will have to remain altogether unknown to men, or else make itself known in some different way. The statement that there is any such thing and the statement that there is no such thing are neither of them statements that science can make. Okay. So Lewis is kind of carving out the technical definition of what science can and cannot do. So the question I have in the notes, why are questions about something behind the material universe not answerable by science? And if you want, we can even bring in this poster, defenders of truth, science is our future.
Well, first of all, science doesn't have all the data.
Okay.
If it doesn't have all the data, it can't find the truth.
Okay. Anyone else?
Yeah, and it's like science helps us find, things that are true, but there's always, like he said, like Lewis says, like it's through experiments and how things either evolve or change, depending on how the world is or how our technology is or certain things. There's so many different variables. So I don't know. Yeah.
Well, what you're saying there boils down to science fact versus science theory. Because if it's theory, it's not yet proven. It's an idea, and it may have some basis in information for a basis, but it's not a proven idea yet. Where certain things are proven, like I don't know. Like, okay, you put copper, nickel, and carbon together, you get a certain material. And you do that every time, it's going to be the same. So that is science fact.
Well,
Go ahead.
one thing I was going to say off of that, though, how social things happen socially or culturally, how that can enable whether something is fact or not.
Well, a lot of people like to say evolution is fact, but it's still only theory because it's not totally proven. And if you get with a real top-end biologist, they'll still be evolutionists, but they'll admit that it's not fact yet because there's still loose ends. But it's very close to fact.
The lecture that I was listening to by John Lennox, he addressed this. He said he basically said that because the idea of evolution is so intricately tied to worldview, that it's tough for people to let it be judged as any scientific theory is rightly judged because of the worldview implications that would come about if parts of it were proven wrong. Whereas, stuff like we talked earlier about decay rates and carbon dating, if demonstrable evidence comes to light that the decay rate of carbon over time is greatly diminished, I don't think that's going to cause anyone to really kind of go crazy. But, well, to some degree, but evolution, on the other hand, I mean, that is a worldview, and to give that up, a lot of the people I know who are the most outspoken people on evolution, they basically see giving that up akin to basically saying that there is a God. And so I think when it comes to this idea of evolution, I mean, true scientists would absolutely want to test the theory to the extent that we can, to discern truth, to discern how valid Darwin's claims were in the pursuit of truth. But because the worldview component comes into play, it's almost like the sacred cow.
To add on to that, just piggyback on what you're saying, Scott, it's what it made me think of too, like very simply, if you just look at things in the most simplest point of view, like this one guy asked them, these kids, like, okay, well, not kids, these students at a university, like why, like, okay, like, do you guys like believe like in evolution? How many believe in evolution? Every single hand went up. And he said, okay. And he's like, well, then can you guys tell me why you believe this, you know? And only one person actually brought up something about science. And then after he refuted that, no one had said anything. And then he finally, another hand came up and said, because I learned it in school. You know, and so simply what I'm trying to say is, I don't know about you, but once I've made a choice, that just that simple fact makes it really hard to change. Even if the choice is like, hey, I've decided I'm going to go to Hy-Vee before I go to Scott's house. And then someone's like, hey, you know what? Like, Hy-Vee's actually closed. You're like, what? You know, you have to be forced to not to go Hy-Vee, which you weren't even sure if you're going to go before. But once you made that choice, and so I'm not exactly sure. I'd love to study more about that personally, but something I've thought a lot about and seen in myself and other people is that. So I think to some extent, that's part of the reason why I think like, you know, what you said about the worldview that John Lennox had said that is very astute of him. And if you like put that with the fact that we just don't want to change, I think that's a big part of it. And that's not just been evolution. That's been many different science theories, like the world is flat. You know what I mean? Or I remember there was another one, I can't remember. I think I brought it up in another time, so I won't bring it up. But basically saying what everybody else said, like a good example of that is like when we're talking about evolution, we're talking about millions of years. Well, science involves experience. What we said, experiment. You cannot do that. We have zero experiment of millions of years.
Yeah.
So it is an actuality. It is a worldview. It's a religion. It's a belief system. You have to believe in it. There's nothing, you have to have faith in that it's real, because we don't have the evidence of it.
Well, and that's one of the ironic things, at least in my understanding of the world, like especially here in our country. I mean, ever since that letter, I think it was Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Baptist Association or whatever, where the phrase separation of church and state turned up, that has basically been the governing philosophy that has progressively been implemented, you know, on down to today. But the funny thing is, if you don't have faith in a God, you still have a God. It's humanism. I mean, it is humanity. Like, that is your God. I mean, and I think the way people who, you know, claim to be atheists or agnostics constantly look to experts for their understanding of the world really reinforces that. So it's fascinating that all of us creatures, all of us humans, do make a God. The only question is, you know, where do we get our God from? And that's where, again, as a Christian, you know, we can look to things like what Lewis is arguing here, and to the truth laid out in Scripture, you know, to see what the right God is. But that's going way beyond where Lewis goes here in book 1. That's for sure. But yeah, Amy.
Yes.
I'm giving you an opportunity to weigh in. I'm pointing at you with the red pen.
Well, actually, you're pointing at my ear, but that's
okay. We'll come back to you then. All right, let's move on. Here we go. The answer lies within. The last blank lies within. Which that sounds so like, what's the phrase? So self-esteem building, like the answer lies within.
Yeah.
So, but I think this will be an interesting point to discuss. Here we go. Now the position would be quite hopeless, but for this. There is one thing, and only one, in the whole universe which we know more about than we could learn from external observation. That one thing is man. We do not merely observe men, we are men. In this case, we have, so to speak, inside information. We are in the know, and because of that, we know that men find themselves under a moral law, which they did not make and cannot quite forget even when they try. and which they know they ought to obey. Notice the following point. Anyone studying man from the outside as we study electricity or cabbages, which that's a hilarious phrase, not knowing our language and consequently not being able to get inside knowledge from us, but merely observing what we did, would never get the slightest evidence that we had this moral law. How could he? For his observations would only show what we did, and the moral law is about what we ought to do. In the same way, if there were anything above and behind the observed facts in the case of stones or the weather, we, by studying them from the outside, could never hope to discover it. And moving on to the next quote. The position of the question then is like this. We want to know whether the universe simply happens to be what it is for no reason, or whether there is a power behind it that makes it what it is. Since that power, if it exists, would be not one of the observed facts, but a reality which makes them, no mere observation of the facts can find it. There is only one case in which we can know whether there is anything more, namely our own case. And in that one case, we find out there is. Or put it the other way around. If there was a controlling power outside the universe, it could not show itself to us as one of the facts inside the universe. No more than the architect of a house could actually be a wall or a staircase or a fireplace in that house. The only way in which he could expect to show itself would be inside ourselves as an influence or a command trying to get us to behave a certain way. And that is just what we do find in ourselves. Surely this ought to arouse our suspicion. In the only case where you can expect to get an answer, the answer turns out to be yes. I thought that was super profound. He ultimately, in those two quotes, is going back to the point he makes in the first part of this book, that there's this moral law bearing down on us, but then brings into the idea the scientific method. You know, if you were just on the outside observing us humans and figuring us out scientifically without having any sort of internal knowledge, you would not get the idea of a moral law at all. And so I thought that was a pretty profound point in this chapter on science. So let's go to the next question. What are your thoughts on looking within ourselves as the proof of something behind the moral universe? So is this a good argument, or what are your thoughts?
I think maybe it's a good argument.
Yeah, you do think it's a good argument?
Mhm.
Have you ever, Amy, found yourself thinking about the universe in that perspective before? Because I know I didn't.
Sometimes.
Okay. Hey, and just make sure you're using some of these discussions when you're debating with your daughter, okay?
Gotcha.
Okay. Wernleys, Mike?
That concept is totally foreign to me right now.
Okay.
I can't say that I could speak as specific, but as far as the actual idea of finding that, exploring that from within, I'd say that was my personal experience of being totally convicted of God's truth.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you guys have ever seen a movie called Inception by chance.
I've heard you reference it, but I have not seen it.
Leonardo DiCaprio movie. And so I'm starting to do this thing. I remember I used to listen to speakers, and like Robbie's one of them, where he'd say certain things again and again and again,
Mm-hmm.
And I used to always think, no, never say the same thing twice. But I found actually, sometimes they say things so amazingly because they've said it so many times, So I'll say that. Sorry if you guys already heard it, but just in that movie, it's about dreams within dreams. So people have found a way to go into each other's dreams and stuff like that. And so imagine living a life where you can go in other dreams. It would make it very hard for you to know what's real.
Hmm.
And so really the concept of questioning reality is explored well in that way through the story. And really the movie's answer to that was guilt.
Mm.
the reason Leonardo DiCaprio could know the difference, although they did have this little devices that they would use to help them tell the difference between reality and not. And I
Mhm.
won't get into that a lot, but it was a very specific device, and they knew that, like, if they're in someone else's dream, they wouldn't be able to fake that device. However, what really made him know the difference wasn't the device; it was the guilt. He knew the guilt that of something he had done wrong could prove that what he had done, and it proved the reality of it. And we know that guilt is the enemy's tool. That's an answer to God's tool, conviction.
Mm.
And in the English Standard Version translation of Hebrews 11, verse 1 is that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen.
Mm.
And my encounter with Jesus, and when I was 24, and since then, continual encounters and times of speaking with the Lord and hearing from him, even within, meeting people that have different schools of thought about that kind of thing, let alone like inside Christianity, let alone outside of Christianity. The conviction of the truth of it is more powerful to me than my senses.
Mm.
And because I don't know about you, but mostly I use my senses and my intellect to have a sense of what I believe in.
Mhm.
However, I believe I've been given a new tool that the best word I can use for it is conviction. And maybe another word though is that's let's say a side of the jewel called faith, a
Mhm.
facet of faith. But back then, like, faith to me just kind of meant like, you just kind of hope for the best. That's when I was a little kid. Like, you just hope it's true. I don't know. If it's not true, then, well, you're just dead. But if it is true, then you get to go to heaven. Like, that's what I thought faith meant, and I found that that's not biblical faith at all. And so, but again, the reality of the universe was found within, though.
And it's so fascinating because, like, I'm going to rephrase this, Jeremy. If this isn't exactly what you're saying, you can tell me otherwise. But as I look back over my Pilgrim's Progress, after having read Lewis and listened to guys like Ravi and those amazing teachers who have influenced me, it has made the influence of God in the events in my earlier years stand out much more clearly. It didn't lessen the impact of them, but it really did piece it together in a cohesive way that the fingerprint of God was really the only way I could describe it. I mean,
Yeah.
there really was no other way to describe it. And it's amazing to me that God in his, like, it's so tough for me thinking about teaching. Like, Drea, you probably remember when I was the Sunday school Bible teacher for the little kids. Trying to connect with the younger kids is not my strong suit. But to think about that difference and the challenge it was for me, like, imagine it between God and reaching out to us. And so, Jeremy, as you're talking, I was thinking, like, man, all those experiences, not only is God so complex that he can put the universe together in a cohesive way that it doesn't just break down, but he's able to dumb it down and impact his children, his elect, if you will, even when they have no proper framework to think of it. So I don't know if that's not what you were describing. At least that's what my mind was going to as you were telling your story there.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I'm not exactly sure, but it definitely sparked like the thought of, for me, like, I've noticed that there is an intellectual focus and a spiritual focus, for maybe a lack of a better way to put it. And I find the conviction I'm talking about is more of like the spiritual focus and the moments of like utter awareness
Mhm.
of the reality that goes beyond my mental capability.
Mhm.
And then in moments when I'm not really there, I find things like what you're talking about help strengthen that aspect of things.
Okay.
So like when I'm listening to something like Ravi or even in myself, like my own thought, like I said, the thought process that I had where of something can't come from nothing, that led me back to a spiritual reality that I actually had already had when I was a child before I could even comprehend mentally the things that was leading me there,
Mhm.
So I think in some ways, the same way the enemy tries to use our mind to go away from the truth, because as you said, it's actually incapable of really, because if we were really smart, the enemy wouldn't have a chance to convince us God doesn't exist. It's only because we are ignorant, and that means that we lack knowledge, right? Only because we lack knowledge could we actually not believe in the very, the actual reality of it. I can only imagine what it's like for spiritual beings to watch us, to be like, wow, they really cannot believe that God's exist. Wow, this is crazy. Let's keep going on this. And then on vice versa, the ones who are good, the angels, are probably like, oh my goodness, like they need so much help. We love them. Let's help them, because they are very lost little children. The smartest man is a complete fool. And by man, I mean mankind. Whether that was man or woman is irrelevant, But again, going back to, because we are ignorant, I think the enemy uses our mind to get us away from spiritual focus, because spiritual reality kind of destroys that, which is why Jesus came to bring us to spiritual life, right? From spiritual death. But I think the same way God uses your mind too. So like you have someone like Stephen Hawking saying things and my brain goes this way. And then you have someone like Ravi Zacharias talking and my brain goes this way. And then we also have our own thoughts that can do the same.
Yeah. Just one, Dre, I was thinking of your brother, actually. I can't remember if he said this publicly or if this was a conversation he and I had, but to piggyback off what Jeremy said, I remember your brother talking about a Bible class he was in at Luther College, and him saying how, he had grown up in the church under your dad, and yet what they were saying over here about the same things that the Bible said and your dad said were just totally at cross purposes. And if I remember correctly, it was one of those experiences that really kind of pushed him to a deeper level of commitment. Does that sound correct?
Yeah, you're exactly right. Yeah.
So, to piggyback off of Jeremy's story, it's just, again, to the amazingness of God, in our finite nature, being able to reach out to us in our ignorance, in our limited mental capacity, again, continues to be amazing. And to be able to sort out truth from error, as we hear all these voices around us, again, is very much a Holy Spirit thing. And on a side note, part of the reason why I'm persuaded of the Calvinist Reformed perspective of theology is kind of like what you're saying. Like, when I look in it of myself, there's nothing in myself that I ever saw reaching out for God when he got me. It was God reaching out to me in various circumstances. And that just is totally contrary to, kind of the, as I understand it, the perspective of, kind of the Arminian view, where it's like people are seeking after God. It's like, nah, I wasn't seeking after God. I wasn't a hellion, but I was not actively, passionately seeking out for God. It was him just grabbed me, and I couldn't have done it on my own. So
can I ask you a question? I think that I might know the answer to this, but it's actually a legitimate question though, with that being said. With you saying that, have you ever heard some people say the Spirit just kind of made me do this? You ever heard that? Where like if someone gets up in the middle of a sermon and starts speaking in tongues, they say, well, the Spirit made me. I didn't have a choice. Have you ever heard something like that before?
I have. And I can't remember if I shared this with you, but I was a part of a charismatic church for my last year of high school and first year of college. And so there were a number of preachers, revivalists, and those sort of people who have said that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And as I've grown in my faith, and I'm not claiming to have arrived at this higher plane, but I've come to the point where, I'm going to assume the best in what those guys were trying to communicate. Because all of us, if we were to do Zoom calls of our whole lives, we would find crazy stuff that we said that we meant really well and sounded great in our heads. But then when we opened our mouths, it came out terrible. So I'm going to give those guys the benefit of the doubt. But where I stand, and maybe this isn't exactly where you're going, but am I convinced of election? Yes. I based on looking within and the experiences I know of people around, I don't see anyone who is good and seeking after God, even to a minimal degree. The people that, would say they were seeking after God, Man, is it Lewis? Somebody, I can't remember who said it, but R.C. Sproul. R.C. Sproul made the comment that in those people, really what they're seeking after is not necessarily God, but the benefits of God. Oftentimes that's in the form of fire insurance, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
They're not really seeking after God. And so how does the Spirit made me do it come into play, at least in my mind? That's one of the, I'm going to take the Orthodox answer here. That's a mystery.
Okay.
Because I'm convinced that it's 100% God that drags us to himself, but yet there's 100% culpability on our parts for how we acted out in the world. How and when the Spirit comes into play and kind of like prompts us so strongly that, it's almost without our will, or maybe even against our will, I can't define it. But am I willing to say that there are moments where the Spirit grabs us to such a degree as believers and kind of pushes us to something? I am willing to say that that does happen. I just couldn't give a definitive line to judge exactly when that is. Is that?
Well, no, it's good. I appreciate that. I was just thinking in my mind, because like you're saying, like the Calvinist. So I was like, okay, if depending on someone's Calvinistic point of view, let's see if I can say this correctly, like articulate this in my mind well. So like, say guys, like imagine basically if you're telling me that you're like, hey, if someone says, hey, like the Spirit made me do this, they say, no, like the Spirit didn't do that, like you have responsibility. But then on the other note, then to say, no, there is no responsibility, there's just what God does, would be contradictory.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I found most of the Calvinists that I've met are somewhat conservative, kind of a little bit away from what we would call charismatic and Pentecostal.
Okay.
And so I just think that's interesting for different notes, but not necessarily holistically, but just the idea of like, but what I believe is that you have to hold them both in tension, which
Yeah.
I think I heard you in saying that the best way to put it, and that it is like but I think it is absolutely a mystery, but God's sovereign and you have a choice. Mm-hmm. And you see that in scripture, in same sentences by Jesus and in Paul many times, where God's sovereignty and responsibility are mentioned together, just so that we're quite aware that our brains don't get it, but you have a responsibility and God's sovereign. That's something I understood when I was a kid. I understood God called out David, but I also understood David was making these choices. And so for me in my brain, I started putting such pressure on myself. And so I really wasn't like I started pulling responsibility with me, and sovereignty got like lost in that. And God really has brought it back to so much tension for me. And I found so much peace when I just realized that you got to just hold them both in tension. Both are real and true. So anyways, that's obviously more than a side note.
But you know what? Hey, especially with a small group here, what I hope is we can, work off, some of these rabbit trails and really Proverbs 27:17 is iron sharpens iron, so does one man sharpen another. I mean, that's really the heart, I think, of Equipping Hour anyway. So if it's a rabbit trail, as long as, Mike and Amy don't ditch us, hopefully there's something profitable there.
Oh yeah, I forgot this is a recording.
Mike or Amy, do you want to weigh in on that before I move on?
Well, I guess one of the things that is in my mind was kind of rambling while Jeremy was talking there, but an old saying came across: God will never make you do something against your will; He'll just make you willing to go. But then I thought of Jonah, who was an unwilling participant the entire time. Finally, obeyed God, but he's still an unwilling participant because he wanted Nineveh destroyed. Mm-hmm. He couldn't see any way out of not getting Nineveh destroyed, and he was basically ticked off because it didn't happen. Mm-hmm. So I don't know why I even brought that up, but it just came across that what Jeremy was saying. I was brought that first one, the willing versus unwilling. Mm-hmm. But then I thought of the Jonah bit, and I said, well, we're not always willing participants. but sometimes we're obeying even though we're kind of unwilling.
I think that Jonah story is a great illustration of that. I know in talking to students, outside of class at school, when they ask me about, faith matters and obedience and that sort of stuff. I mean, what I go back to is your best bet is to go along as a Christian obeying God. That's your best bet. Jonah's story would have been dramatically better for him if he had gone along with what God was calling him to do. However, thank God that book's in there. And I think gives a piece of evidence to show that this whole Judeo-Christianity is not human made. Because if it were human made, you wouldn't put a story of Jonah in there. Like you would focus and primarily push forward guys who did it all right for you to look up to. But Jonah's a hot mess, even at the end of the book, regardless of where the VeggieTale movie stops. Jonah's a hot mess, and so Jeremy, I was thinking of something else as you were finishing and Mike was talking about Jonah there. In my experience in a lot of those charismatic churches, there were a lot of people who, spoke in terms like you described, and on the other side, on the sin side, would say stuff, like, this temptation is from the flesh, this temptation is from the devil, this temptation is from the world, the flesh, and the devil. And I remember thinking at some point, it's like, my job is to walk in obedience to Christ. I don't see it as significant in sorting out what is what. Who cares whether the sin and temptation is from the world, the flesh, and the devil? If it's sin, it's still sin. And on the other side of that coin, if it is the Holy Spirit prompting and leading me, I see it as my responsibility to act rather than to identify it as such. So plus, because of, again, in my fallen nature, I'm so aware of not wanting to put words into God's mouth or ascribe to him motives or directives, that I just stay away from that altogether. And if I do really feel God prompting me or through the Holy Spirit, I typically won't say it. Or if I do, I'll say something along the lines like, hey, this could be God, this could be the Holy Spirit, I don't know. But here's what I'm going to tell you. And it's a little bit of a cop-out, I guess, but at the same time, God, I've seen God at work. Thank God, through the best moments of obedience and even him smacking me around in the worst of my disobedience. And so I guess acting consistently with what I see in scripture and with that prompting is more how I'm trying to focus, as opposed to ascribing it to who, what, when, where, how sort of thing. So I don't know.
Well, I think I think it's fair to say that you're a thinker, Scott, and that I think it's even fair to say intellectual. And I know that I'm not trying to give you labels to take home with you, but I'm just giving you some encouragement that I think it's fair to say, Scott, that that actually it says a lot about your relationship with God, that he's taking you to a point where you allow for yourself to align yourself with like simple things like that, to say, hey, you know what, I don't need to have all these answers, because I imagine there's an aspect of yourself that actually had a drive to want to have all the different answers and to categorize things and to have a certain amount of control, but instead, or at least sense of control, right? But instead you've allowed for yourself to like give him that control. And so with that being said, I would say, like when Jesus was tempted to, like Satan was trying to say in the wilderness, hey, Jesus, like you can have all these things, right? Mm-hmm. And if you would just like bow down to me, showed him like what it take him to the top of the temple, right? And then said like, you can have all of this, or no, that point where he's at the cliff and he says, hey, you can have all of this, which is actually what God was giving Jesus, but Satan was trying to pretend as though that's what he has to give. He said, I'll give you all of this. Jesus didn't have that temptation didn't spur from a sin in his heart. It spurred from it was actually just straight up from the enemy. And I think all of us have that. And I think sometimes it actually does matter to know the difference. And I know for me personally, because sometimes I'm like a temptation is revealing, oh my gosh, I did not realize that this is in my heart. And that has led to a lot of important conversations of purifying of my heart with the Lord.
Mhm.
However, and this didn't start happening until I specifically prayed the prayer, Psalms about cleanse my heart, Lord God. And so, and then after that, sorry, losing train of thought. But to know sometimes when certain temptations come, that's not coming from my heart. That was actually important to know. So that I'm not like in a weird place, because I've seen other people get in weird places about that kind of thing too. Like, oh, I must, like, what's wrong with me, and this and that. And it's just be like, nothing's wrong with you. Like, the enemy sees that you're doing great things. He's trying to get you distracted,
Mhm.
And so you just need to know that. And so I think learning to discern the difference can actually be paramount for somebody.
Yeah, and you know what? You better watch it, because I might recommend that you do an equipping hour on that, Jeremy. So just be careful. No, and that would be fun to explore more later on, because I am genuinely curious, like, since we had our little coffee conversation, to hear more of that sort of thing in the iron sharpening iron component of your Pilgrim's Progress and my Pilgrim's Progress. So we'll table that for a future time.
Okay.
I'm going to finish this up, because I think Sarah Mesky, when she watches this, she's going to be looking at the screen with daggers in her eyes. So, so we'll finish
Sorry.
this on. No, hey, Jeremy, I'm there with you, man. Mr. Rabbit Trail. Right here. Anyway, let's get to conclusion and bring this on home. Conclusion with a word of caution. Do not think I am going faster than I really am. I am not yet within 100 miles of the God of Christian theology. All I have got is something which is directing the universe, and which appears in me as a law urging me to do right and making me feel responsible and uncomfortable when I do wrong. I think we have to assume it is more like a mind than it is like anything else we know, because after all, the only thing we know is matter, and you can hardly imagine a bit of matter giving instruction. So really, this just a summary of chapter 4. But then he throws this in at the end. And the last blank, hybrid. In the era of COVID, I've used the word hybrid more times in the last 3 months than in my entire life combined. Hybrid. There's a hybrid view. And that is called the creative life force evolution view. And I'll read it here. People who hold this view say that the small variations by which life on this planet evolved from the lowest forms to man were not due to chance, but to striving or purposiveness of a life force. So I know, Mike, you had kind of alluded to this, and Jeremy with the pantheism. When people say this, we must ask them whether by life force they mean something with a mind or not. If they do, then a mind bringing life into existence and leading it to perfection is really a god, and their view is thus identical with the religious view. If not, or excuse me, if they do not, then what is the sense of saying that something without a mind strives or has purposes? This seems to be to me to be fatal to their view. One reason why many people find creative evolution so attractive is that it gives one much of the emotional comfort of believing in God with none of the less pleasant consequences. And then there was this line, which is great. All the thrills of religion, but none of the costs. And we talked about this earlier here in this group, but I think going back to the idea that Darwinian evolution is really a worldview more than a scientific, theory to be judged, it really speaks to this. It allows people to live without God. I mean, that's the bottom line. And the fact of the matter is, Darwin's view actually wasn't even unique to Darwin. There were a couple of details that he added in, but supposedly, if I remember reading correctly, his grandfather was espousing the same stuff before him, and John Lennox in that lecture I was listening to takes it back even further. So it gives people a reason to believe that there's no God. That's what it primarily does. So any concluding thoughts on that before I bring us home with the scripture passages?
One thing you can research for me in your due diligence. I had heard that on his deathbed, Darwin wished he had never written the book.
Ooh. I'd heard something. Somebody quote that he had a deathbed conversion, but
I never heard of a deathbed conversion, but I think I heard that he had second thoughts on his theory. But
if I stumble upon that answer, I'll let you know.
I read it somewhere.
Yeah.
Or dreamt it, and somebody pushed that dream into my brain. I don't know, but who knows?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Darwin was a scientist, so if that statement is true, and if it was from his professional mind, I mean, true scientists are always evaluating the views they hold and judging them in light of the evidence. So maybe there is something to that.
Did you read a case for Christianity, a case for creation
By Lee Strobel?
by Strobel?
Yeah, I've read parts of it. I've not read it from front to back the whole way through.
I have not read it front to back because every time I read it, I get about 20, 30 pages and my head starts hurting.
Yep.
So-
It's written like a lawyer.
So, but there's a lot of interesting tidbits in there.
Yeah. That was, again, I'm stealing from this lecture I listened to with John Lennox, but that was one of the points he makes. It's like when you talk about evidence for something, you have to distinguish between evidence like a scientist would require for scientific theory versus evidence like you would ask for in a court of law.
I'm thinking, John, the one I sent you.
Okay, it might be.
I'd have to double check that.
Yeah. And so at any rate, the whole,
Usually wears a brown shirt with the yellow, with a brown silk coat.
that sounds familiar. Yeah. Going back to this last passage here before we tie it all up with scripture, it's interesting. I think Lewis avoids the question of theistic evolution. And when my mind goes back to what we talked about in The Problem of Pain, Mike, you were in that class. Lewis has that one chapter, I want to say around chapter 5 or something, where he gives his kind of like theoretical how Adam and Eve kind of came about in a very evolutionary sort of description.
Oh, I don't remember that.
No, that's good. It's not worth reading again. But I mean, that's one of the areas where Lewis, where I couldn't quite tell if Lewis was like articulating that view because that's what he really held, or if he was just genuinely trying to imagine Adam and Eve coming about by evolutionary means. Regardless, I don't hold to Darwinian evolution personally, and for the main reason being, when you look at the fossil record, like the fossil record just does not show these transitions that Darwin hypothesized would have to be there in order to for his theory to be true. It just, they're just not there. And one thing I would point people towards, if anyone watches this on YouTube, look up Cambrian fossil layer. If you look up Cambrian fossil layer, it almost reads like Genesis. I mean, it's like you look down below the Cambrian fossil layer and all you see is simple celled sort of creatures. You get above it, boom, complexity just explodes. There's not this gradual system of change to get from the simple to the complex. It's just all of a sudden they're there. And as I see that, I can't help but go back to, in my mind, to Genesis. And so
A year or so ago, some group came out, a group of scientists said that man originated with one man and woman.
Mm.
There was a group of scientists that actually came out and said that.
Mm-hmm.
And it was on the news, and it was talked about for 2 days, and I've never heard it since.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, let's be honest, the vast majority of the intellectual elite are really averse to anything that would seem to suggest that origins as they are laid out in scripture are true. Like, they're really averse to that. So the fact that they even reported on it in some sort of public way is actually surprising. But
Well, that surprised me.
yeah. Yeah. Amy, do you want to weigh in on anything at this point? Because I've blabbed a lot.
That's okay. Absolutely. I don't have anything.
Okay. No, the fact that you continue to stick around until the end, Amy, you deserve a gold star.
Thanks.
Jeremy, Andrea, any concluding thoughts before I jump down here to close us out with scripture?
No, it was good.
Yeah.
Okay, well, the universal theme for book 1 seems to be this Romans chapter 2 passage. And I'll read it again. And again, what I hope, Jeremy, you'd mentioned repetition. I hope by continuing to come back to this passage, this really sticks with you guys. So if you get into the discussion with people, you can point to Romans chapter 2 as evidence that biblical evidence of pointing to an internal law in everyone's heart. But let me read it again. Romans chapter 2, starting at verse 14. Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law, since they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts. Their consciences are also bearing witness, and their thoughts now accusing, even defending them. Pointing to that universal moral law that God wrote, not just in the heart of the Jewish people, but on all of humanity. So, but then rather than just lazily go back to Romans 1 to point towards the rest of this book, which Romans 1 works really well with it, my mind this time went to the Psalms. It went to Psalm 19, and I won't read this whole passage because we've run so late, but I'll read the first part of it, and then we'll close things down here. Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech. They use no words. No sound is heard from them, yet their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. And I'll stop it there. The rest of Psalm 19 is really good too, but the heavens declare the glory of God. Looking at the order and structure of creation was what motivated a lot of the early scientists, because they believed in a God who could be understood through the order and structure of his creation. And that same order and structure is there as well for us to observe. So that's chapter 4. Next Sunday, chapter 5. And so
High five there.
yeah, we'll bring this to a close. I may go on a raid to stalk some of the people this week who did not show up to see if they like us anymore or not, but I'm going to hopefully guilt. Okay, Jeremy, I know we talked about guilt and shame, but I'm going to try to guilt them into coming back for one more week. Won't be my finest moment.
Just kidding,
Might
of
be some
course.
people that this is kind of over their head. I have a wife that feels that way.
Yeah, and I can't fault them for that. Yeah. Well, you know what? But I can't fault them for that. I'm gonna still try to coerce them to come in. So anyway, hey, well, yeah. Any concluding thoughts before I sign off here?
Oh, I was just gonna say this is great though, even though it was a smaller group. We went past longer, so it was cool to hear everyone talk, all of us talk. So that was really cool to hear different perspectives.
There's definitely value in smaller groups, that's for sure. And I hate to say it, but even if I were the only one on here, I would probably still read through this because it's really good for me. And so the fact that you all joined along, it's good stuff. It's good stuff. So
Thanks
well,
for reading. Wait, can you share what you were sharing in the car of reading reading the chapters, how you're glad about?
Oh yeah. I think I can remember. I guess I said that it was equipping. I literally used that word. Just in the same, probably similar how you felt with apologetics and things in general. I think that there's been many things that have to just be gifts from God, wisdom and knowledge within me that I have. And then when someone speaks, I had such a frustration, even as a young child, really, honestly, to explain how, to really just articulate what I'm trying to say and articulate to just the fallacies in what they're saying. Not even saying like, not like, hey, I'm a Democrat's the best party and Republicans the best party. Like, hey, there's not much I can say about that. I mean, we can start talking about it, but that's an opinionistic thing. But when you say, self-refuting statements, I would want to be like, hey, listen, like these two things just don't match up. And that's all I'm saying. And, so when you said this, and I remember as a child, like, if I did try to, I was just called an argumentative child.
Yeah.
And I would just be like, no, in somewhat of the innocence of child, even though that's not true, we were born in sin, there was just like, it wasn't even on my mind to call you stupid or to call me smart. I'm just like a questioning child. And, you've presented to me a school that taught me to reason. And so when you spoke and were unreasonable and there wasn't coherence with what you're saying, that it didn't correspond. I just wanted to point that out so that we could move forward. And these kind of things and reading that and listening to that was very equipping. I've found C.S. Lewis that way in general. So, and I don't know that I would have been re-engaging mere Christianity right now if I hadn't been for this class. So I don't know. Sorry, is that a long version of it? I don't know. I try to get like the right version.
We were talking about it a lot.
Did I get that right?
Yeah, no,
Okay.
it's good. Yeah.
Hey, Jeremy, if we end up doing book 2, I had talked to Pastor Jerry about possibly doing book 2 in the spring. I'm going to be coaching Seth's Quad City Christian basketball team, so I can't do it here in November, December, but I may use part of that as a promo. So
Perversion, let me know. But
yeah. We'll clean it up, throw some makeup on you, put you in something other than a Nike sweatshirt, make it look nice. We'll see what we can do and make it go well. But
Little powder on the forehead.
yeah, there we go. Yep.
Yeah.
Hey, but
yeah, what I was just trying to say, it's help me articulate my
hello?
even within my head, let alone just feel more equipped and less frustrated, even, empowered. And that's true. I'm not just saying that for your promotion.
Well, and praise God for that, because go
There's
ahead,
a
Mike.
lot inside my head that are a lot clearer than what I say.
Mhm.
Yeah.
All of us.
I relate. Yeah.
No, and I can resonate with that, because I remember having some questions that I know my mom wasn't able to answer. And it frustrated me, because I hated feeling like this Christianity that I knew growing up as a Catholic, which made so much sense, that there weren't answers out there, to some of those challenging questions that were kind of, coming into my life. I mean, at the time. But yeah, Lewis just started me off on a path where it's like, okay, like in many respects, it's a sanctifying of the mind. And, I remember in the Czech camp, one of the questions we had is, in your own Pilgrim's Progress, what came first, the redemption of your heart or the redemption of your mind? And it was interesting, because some people said mind, some people said heart. But I think regardless of the avenue that God used to bring you into his fold, both need to come into alignment with Christ. And that's part of the sanctification process, brother.
That's good. I like that.
Part of the sanctification process. So anyway, I'm going to go. I know I have some work to do for school, but let's do it again next week.
Okay.
Sounds good. Thank
Awesome.
you, Scott.
Appreciate you guys.
Great to see you.
Hey,
Good to see you.
have a good weekend, everyone. Bye.
Bye.